She thought a few carefully chosen words could get him removed from first class. After all, it had always worked before. But this time, the man in the navy suit didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket and calmly revealed something that silenced the entire plane, an FBI badge. Meet Evelyn Bancroft, a seasoned socialite used to traveling first class from Dallas to D.C., where every flight felt like her private club. That is, until she found herself seated next to Malcolm Rhodes, a composed black man quietly typing on his laptop. Her discomfort turned to suspicion, then to public outrage, when she pressed the call button and whispered those loaded words, "I don't feel safe." What happened next was caught on camera, and the internet did not hold back. This isn't just a story about prejudice, it's about consequences. Stay with us until the end to see how Evelyn's world unraveled at 30,000 feet, and beyond. And if this story makes you think, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Evelyn Bancroft was a woman of habit. At 68, she had built a life around comfort, predictability, and control. Every other week, she boarded American Airlines Flight 1487 from Dallas-Fort Worth to Washington, D.C., always in first class, always seat 2A. She wore pearls, carried a monogrammed leather tote, and expected the familiar routine: early boarding, a chilled glass of sparkling wine, and quiet conversation with like-minded professionals. But on this flight, that routine was broken. As she approached her row, Evelyn spotted someone already seated in 2B, a tall, sharply dressed black man in a navy suit, typing on a sleek laptop. He didn't look up. He didn't offer a smile. He was absorbed in his work. And that, to Evelyn, was unacceptable. Something inside her bristled. This wasn't how first class was supposed to feel. Without exchanging a single word, she'd already made up her mind: he didn't belong. The man's name was Malcolm Rhodes. He was calm, collected, and utterly unbothered by her silent judgment. But Evelyn's discomfort soon transformed into subtle action. She accidentally nudged his armrest, glanced around for a flight attendant, and finally leaned over with a rehearsed smile. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" she asked, her tone polite but her message unmistakable. Malcolm's answer was simple: yes. When the flight attendant confirmed that Malcolm was exactly where he was supposed to be, Evelyn's irritation deepened. She requested a seat change. When no first-class seats were available, she hesitated, only to then suggest, with an air of quiet condescension, that he be moved to coach. It was subtle. But it wasn't lost on those nearby. This wasn't the overt racism of the 1960s. This was the kind that hid behind polite smiles and coded language. Evelyn never once mentioned race, but her body language, her entitlement, and her use of a powerful phrase, "I don't feel safe," spoke volumes. What Evelyn didn't know was that Malcolm had heard it all before. And he knew exactly how this game was played. But what she also didn't know was that Malcolm wasn't just a businessman, he was a federal agent. An FBI special investigator, flying home after a classified assignment. And when she escalated her claim, trying to paint him as a threat, Malcolm simply closed his laptop, reached into his coat, and held up his badge. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. The cabin fell silent. Phones came out. Passengers whispered. Evelyn had tried to use a system that had long protected her biases. But now, the system pushed back. This is not just a story about a woman on a flight, it's about how racism, even when masked by manners and false politeness, still exists in the everyday. And how, in today's world, exposure is only one smartphone away. Evelyn Bancroft may have smiled through tight lips, but inside, her frustration was boiling. She couldn't believe what was happening, her first-class flight experience, disrupted by someone who, in her mind, clearly didn't fit. Malcolm Rhodes was composed, professional, and silent, but his very presence was an affront to the exclusive comfort Evelyn felt entitled to. She had flown this route for over a decade, and not once had she been made to feel this, uneasy. She pressed the call button again. This time, her tone dropped lower, more deliberate. "I'd like to speak to someone in charge," she told the lead flight attendant, her eyes darting toward Malcolm with poorly disguised contempt. When asked to clarify, she lowered her voice and said it, "I just don't feel comfortable." That phrase, so often used to conceal bias, hung in the air like smoke. She didn't say why she was uncomfortable. She didn't need to. In a country where coded language has long been used to justify discrimination, her intent was crystal clear. This wasn't about the seat. It was about the man sitting next to her. Malcolm didn't rise to it. He stayed calm, fingers still resting on his closed laptop. He had been in this position before, not necessarily in a first-class cabin, but in countless other spaces where his presence was silently challenged, where people made assumptions based on nothing more than his skin. He didn't need to explain himself. He belonged here, and he knew it. But Evelyn wasn't finished. She pressed further, implying she didn't feel safe. That word, said quietly but intentionally, shifted the mood of the cabin. Safety. On an airplane. It was a loaded accusation, one meant to provoke a response and raise alarm. Several passengers nearby stiffened. One began filming discreetly. People were paying attention. The flight attendant, young, professional, and clearly uncomfortable, remained composed. She reminded Evelyn that Malcolm had a valid first-class ticket and would not be moved. Evelyn, still holding her ground, suggested that he be seated in coach instead. The audacity stunned everyone within earshot. Malcolm's posture didn't change, but the look in his eyes sharpened. This was more than inconvenience. This was racial profiling, executed through whispers and faux concern, dressed in pearls and entitlement. Evelyn had judged him the moment she saw him, and now she was trying to rewrite the rules to suit her prejudice. And yet, the moment Evelyn tried to invoke fear as justification, her plan backfired. Because when Malcolm pulled out his FBI badge, everything stopped. The passengers who had been watching held their breath. Evelyn's face paled. She had tried to frame a federal agent as a threat, based solely on race. That moment, quiet but explosive, laid bare the truth: racism doesn't always wear a hood or shout slurs. Sometimes, it wears a silk scarf and smiles while pressing the call button. The moment Malcolm Rhodes displayed his FBI badge, the cabin atmosphere shifted like a thunderclap. Passengers who had watched the uncomfortable exchange now sat in stunned silence. Evelyn Bancroft, once confident in her quiet authority, froze. Her perfectly styled hair and expensive blazer did little to shield her from the weight of what she had just done. She had tried to use the familiar language of fear, words that, for decades, had been weaponized against people who looked like Malcolm, to paint him as a threat. But now, the truth was undeniable. The young woman seated 3 rows back, who had started recording once Evelyn said she didn't feel safe, zoomed in on the badge. Her fingers moved quickly, uploading the video to Twitter with a short, brutal caption. Racist woman tries to boot black man from first class. He's FBI. Within minutes, the clip began circulating. The contrast was too powerful, too symbolic to ignore: a privileged white woman attempting to eject a black man from first class, only to discover he had more authority than anyone else on the plane. It was the kind of poetic justice the internet devoured. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat motionless, her mind racing to justify her behavior. But there was no justification. The evidence was digital, and it was spreading fast. Her phone buzzed in her purse, once, twice, then non-stop: calls, texts, social media alerts. She ignored them, but the damage had already begun. As the plane continued toward Washington, D.C., she could feel her world narrowing. The thing she had always relied on, her image, her perceived moral superiority, was slipping through her fingers. Across the aisle, passengers whispered. Some looked at her with disbelief, others with open disapproval. Even the flight attendants, trained to remain neutral, now kept a subtle distance. Evelyn felt isolated, exposed. Malcolm, on the other hand, said nothing more. He reopened his laptop and continued working, his silence louder than any confrontation. For Evelyn, the humiliation wasn't just public, it was personal. She wasn't a cartoon villain in her mind. She served on charity boards, attended diversity luncheons, donated to causes. But none of that could excuse what had just happened. Because racism isn't always violent. Sometimes, it's subtle. It's in the assumptions we make, the fear we project, and the discomfort we believe others should cater to. By the time the plane landed, the video had reached over 100,000 views. And when Evelyn stepped off the jet bridge, she was greeted not by the comfort of routine, but by reporters holding microphones. Her name was trending. Her reputation, once carefully crafted over decades, was unraveling in real time. In a country still grappling with racial bias, this incident became more than a viral moment. It became a mirror. And for Evelyn Bancroft, it revealed a truth she could no longer hide, that even a lifetime of privilege cannot shield you from the consequences of prejudice when the world is watching. Evelyn Bancroft's heels clicked briskly against the tile floor of Reagan National Airport as she hurried toward the exit, eyes darting, heart pounding. The plane had barely come to a stop before she bolted. She didn't look at Malcolm Rhodes. She didn't look at the passengers who had witnessed her humiliation. She just wanted to get out. But as she turned the corner near baggage claim, her worst fear materialized. A small group of reporters stood gathered, phones and microphones in hand. One woman in a navy blazer was mid-sentence, reading from her phone. The now viral video shows a woman attempting to have a black FBI agent removed from first class, citing discomfort. The video has surpassed 1 million views in under 3 hours. Evelyn's breath caught. 1 million. She turned her head quickly, praying she hadn't been seen. But one of the reporters spotted her. "Wait, that's her," someone shouted. Cameras turned. Evelyn didn't answer, she ran. Her hands clutched her designer purse, her polished image cracking with every hurried step. The protective bubble of privilege she had lived in for decades. Gone in an instant. A cab screeched to a stop outside, and Evelyn threw herself into the back seat. "Go," she snapped at the driver. "Now." He glanced at her in the mirror but said nothing as he pulled away. Her phone continued to buzz, a steady rhythm of collapse. The Marston Foundation, where she had served as a senior board member for 15 years, was calling. She let it ring. But she couldn't avoid it forever. The call came again, this time from James Rollins, the chair of the foundation. His voice was clipped, formal. "Evelyn, we've seen the video. The board expects your resignation by morning. We'll be issuing a statement. No discussion. No second chances." Her influence, her prestige, her status, erased by a single moment of exposed bigotry. She tried to speak, to explain, but the call had already ended. Evelyn stared out the window as the city passed by, her reflection barely recognizable in the glass. She had always believed herself to be one of the good ones, a supporter of equality, a woman who donated to causes and spoke kindly to staff. But when confronted with her own unconscious bias, she hadn't just failed, she had doubled down, weaponizing the same language historically used to marginalize Black Americans. She said she didn't feel safe, not because of anything Malcolm had done, but because of who he was. And in doing so, she revealed a truth many would rather ignore: racism isn't just about hate, it's about fear, entitlement, and the belief that certain people need to explain their presence. The internet had become judge and jury. But it didn't twist the story, it simply exposed it. What Evelyn experienced wasn't a witch hunt. It was accountability. The kind of reckoning that happens when the quiet parts of prejudice are spoken out loud, and someone is finally there to hit record. The days that followed were a blur of headlines, hashtags, and heartbreak, for Evelyn Bancroft. Within 24 hours of her video going viral, her name was plastered across major news outlets. Cable networks debated her actions on primetime. Morning shows discussed the quiet power of racial microaggressions. Think pieces filled editorial columns, the weaponization of whiteness in first class, when discomfort becomes discrimination, and what Evelyn Bancroft reveals about America's silent divide. She stayed inside her home in Georgetown, blinds drawn, television off, but it didn't matter. The world was talking. Former colleagues distanced themselves. Invitations to charity events disappeared overnight. And when the Marston Foundation officially released its statement, it was swift and direct: we condemn all forms of discrimination, whether explicit or implicit. Ms. Bancroft's actions were in direct violation of the values we uphold. Evelyn stared at the statement on her phone, hands trembling. For the first time in her carefully curated life, she was the outsider. There were no carefully worded emails or public relations strategies that could undo what had been captured in high definition and broadcast to millions. The worst part wasn't the silence from her peers, it was the messages from her own grandchildren. One simply wrote, "Grandma, why would you do that?" Another sent her the clip with no caption at all. She had always prided herself on being open-minded, progressive even. But now, faced with the undeniable truth of her actions, Evelyn was forced to confront something much more uncomfortable than a first-class seatmate, herself. She watched the video again, this time not as the victim of public scrutiny, but as a participant in a moment that symbolized a broader, painful history. She saw how she leaned away when Malcolm sat down, how she subtly signaled for help, how her tone shifted when she said she didn't feel safe. None of it was overt. But it was all clear. Malcolm Rhodes, meanwhile, never issued a public statement. He didn't need to. His quiet professionalism and refusal to be baited spoke volumes. He had become, unwillingly, a symbol, not of confrontation, but of dignity. And that silence was what cut Evelyn the deepest. He didn't try to destroy her. He simply showed up, sat down, and refused to disappear. For Evelyn, the fallout was just beginning. But something had changed. The shame wasn't just external anymore, it was internal. And that, in a way, was the first step toward truth. The mirror had been held up, and she could no longer look away. Because in today's America, where smartphones are everywhere and justice doesn't always wait for the courtroom, moments like these remind us: prejudice may whisper, but accountability speaks loud, and everyone's listening. Evelyn Bancroft's story didn't just vanish into the endless churn of the news cycle. It became a flashpoint, a case study in how deeply embedded racial bias can be, even among those who consider themselves cultured, educated, and, above such things. The video of her encounter with Malcolm Rhodes became required viewing in corporate DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, trainings across the country. Universities cited it in sociology lectures. Activists used it as an example of how privilege operates not just through systems, but through subtle, everyday decisions. And while the world debated the implications, Evelyn's own world grew smaller. She tried to return to the country club she had been a member of for over 20 years. The receptionist offered a polite smile, but the looks from other members were cold, distant. Conversations stopped when she walked by. Invitations to luncheons dried up. Even in her once safe circles, her name had become synonymous with quiet racism. Not because she yelled or used slurs, but because she didn't have to. And for many, that was the point. Meanwhile, Malcolm Rhodes continued his work with the Bureau. He declined all interview requests. When asked internally whether he wanted to pursue any legal or public action, his answer was simple: no need. The world saw what it needed to see. That response, measured, composed, only added to his quiet legacy. People admired his restraint. Others questioned why he didn't push harder for consequences. But those who understood the burden of always being the one to teach the lesson recognized the dignity in choosing silence. Back online, the video passed 10 million views. Commenters dug into Evelyn's past, searching for patterns, unearthing old interviews and speeches. One clip from a local fundraiser surfaced, where she had once said, "I believe in inclusivity, as long as people know their place and behave properly." That quote, now played back with ironic emphasis, became a meme, know their place. For Evelyn, the walls kept closing in. Friends stopped returning calls. Her alma mater quietly removed her name from the donor board. One of her neighbors, whom she had known for 30 years, crossed the street to avoid her during a morning walk. But this wasn't about public shaming. It was about truth. About how a single moment can reveal the gaps between who we say we are and how we really see others. Evelyn once believed that racism looked like angry men with torches or hate-filled slogans. She never imagined it could look like a polite woman in pearls pressing a call button and saying, "I don't feel safe." And that realization, that slow, painful awakening, was perhaps the most powerful consequence of all. Because the hardest part about confronting racism is realizing it sometimes lives in the mirror. Months passed. The headlines faded. The hashtags were replaced by newer controversies. But for Evelyn Bancroft, the fallout never truly disappeared, it simply changed shape. The noise outside died down, but the silence within her home grew louder. The grand dinner parties, once held monthly in her colonial-style Georgetown residence, stopped. The silver stayed polished, the wine cellar full, but the guests never came. And yet, something unexpected began to happen. Alone with her thoughts, Evelyn did what she had never been forced to do before, she reflected. Not defensively. Not through the lens of reputation management. But with painful honesty. She reread articles she once dismissed as overreactions. She watched documentaries she used to skip. She listened, really listened, to voices she had long tuned out. She even watched the video again. This time, her eyes welled up not with shame, but with clarity. She saw herself lean away from Malcolm. She saw the discomfort on the flight attendant's face. She saw the woman 3 rows back recording, hoping for accountability. And she saw Malcolm, silent, strong, dignified, refusing to play the part she had written for him. And for the first time, she didn't see herself as a victim. One afternoon, she composed a letter, not for the press, not for image repair, but for Malcolm Rhodes. It began simply. Mr. Rhodes. I know there is nothing I can say to undo the moment I created on that flight. But I want you to know I have spent every day since then learning what I should have seen that day. I saw a man I didn't expect to see in a seat next to mine. And instead of questioning my assumptions, I questioned your right to be there. She never received a reply. And she didn't expect one. The letter wasn't meant to absolve her, it was part of a process she should have started long ago. Quietly, Evelyn stepped down from other boards, began attending racial equity workshops, not the kind with catered lunches and polite applause, but the kind held in community centers with hard chairs and harder truths. She listened. She learned. She sat in the discomfort she once tried to push away. Because true change doesn't come from a viral video or public shame. It comes from what happens after, in the quiet spaces where reflection becomes responsibility. Evelyn Bancroft would never reclaim the status she once held. But in time, she began to build something more meaningful, awareness, humility, and a willingness to grow. And while Malcolm Rhodes continued his work, likely unaware of the full impact he had made that day, his presence alone had sparked a reckoning far larger than that flight. Because sometimes, the most powerful challenge to racism isn't loud. It simply takes its seat, and refuses to move. In today's world, racism doesn't always shout, it often whispers. It hides behind polite smiles, subtle language, and feelings of discomfort that go unchallenged. Evelyn Bancroft's story reminds us that unchecked bias, no matter how refined or well-dressed, can cause real harm. True change begins not with grand statements, but with self-reflection, the kind that asks, what assumptions do I carry with me? If we want a more just and inclusive society, we must be willing to confront those quiet prejudices, even the ones that live within ourselves. If this story moved you, or made you think about something differently, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, share your perspective, and let's keep this conversation going. And if stories like this matter to you, stories that challenge, inspire, and reflect real life, don't forget to subscribe. This channel is a place where we uncover the truth behind life's hidden moments, together.